This talk will be something that is quite unique, I think, and something that has been fascinating me for the past couple of days. And that topic is the topic of shame. And I had been accumulating a great interest in this because I've recently discovered Adam Phillips, which is a psychoanalytic writer, and he's written many books. And I have been watching a lot of his interviews and speeches. And one in particular really struck me was the one with James Mann as the interviewer, interviewing Adam Phillips. And James Mann provokes Adam Phillips to talk about shame. And what struck me when Adam Phillips talked about shame was that he said that shame is something almost uncontested, meaning it almost goes without question because it seems obvious that it is something moral in connection, and that with this shame we attempt to recover our best selves. And I was really fascinated by this concept of shame and how it emerges and the role that it plays in society. And I was contemplating about the moments in my childhood where I felt great shame, and how shame is ultimately very debilitating. And I almost want to say it's a simile for guilt. But there's also something that Adam Phillips said about, well, the question is, what's worse, the shamer or the shamed? Who's more cruel? And then he proceeds to say that the thing that's really interesting for a psychoanalyst is the part where the shame goes unquestioned. The shame goes unthought. And one doesn't really think about the shame or talk about the shame. And I was reflecting about how shame has evolved. And that in our very attempt to eliminate shame from certain things, shame evolves into the other. And to give an example, I will say that let's take the case of homosexuality. If we look back historically, being a homosexual was greatly shamed. In fact, the individual itself would feel very ashamed that one had these desires. But fast forwarding to the present, we see that shame has now evolved into that those who condemn homosexuality should be shamed, right? And they should feel ashamed. And The point of me addressing this is that shame cannot be eradicated in some way. It always takes the form of the opposite, no matter in the ways that we pursue in the name of progress. We make shame become the other, the opposite. And I was thinking about social media and the political terms of cancel culture. And it seems like we can't eradicate this idea of shame, this mode of being the shamer and the ashamed. I have a lot of questions about this because from someone like myself who enjoys reading a psychoanalysis and learning the language of psychoanalysis, I begin to see that there is a simultaneous response. That in some sense, the one that shames can also be unconsciously ashamed. And perhaps vice versa as well, with the person that feels ashamed, or the person that is being shamed, is also unconsciously the shamer. Now, questions arise like, how does one determine the criteria for judging, as Adam Phillips would say? And there's also a question about this idea of forbidden pleasures and unforbidden pleasures, which Adam Phillips has also written a book about. I think there's a lot here to discuss. And perhaps those that listen and are interested, perhaps we can have a conversation about this in some type of symposium Zoom call. Because I feel that this would be a great discussion for a lot of people about shame and about how it emerges, how it evolves, how it is in fact the most debilitating acts one can do to another, and one of the most helpless modes of being when one has done something to be ashamed about. And this attempt, as Adam Phillips would say, the attempt to recover and to stay the course of what we perceive to be our best selves. Well, of course, from a psychoanalytic point of view, what is our best selves? How do we know that? What I love so much about psychoanalysis is that these are the most dubious claims, right? That I know myself, that I know what I want, that I know what I desire, and I know about what I don't desire. How do we attempt to re-describe the relationship one feels and one has with shame? Because it is our tendency to be narrators in our own lives, and also let the influence of others narrate our own actions and participate in our narratives. Where we can also feel and be the one that is shamed or the shamer. I guess the question ultimately ends that it seems shame is inescapable. And if it is inescapable, well, the only option, at least the only option that seems more fruitful, is how does one properly have a relationship with shame? And how does one go about that? What are we to do? How much influence of shame is innate within us? And how much influence of shame is strictly societal? These are questions that are worth raising and having discussion about. I think a wonderful study, actually, that one can do immediately is social media. Where the evolution of shame really takes place right before our eyes. And I've seen a lot of posts ever since I've had Instagram. So this has been about 8-10 years, perhaps. Actually, I would say 6 or 7 years. And what we see, and what I've noticed, is that in social media, it used to be in older times, in the past, where you were shamed for showing more of your body, shamed for being more naked. And now it has evolved into the opposite, where I see many posts embracing one's body, showing more skin, trying to show love to themselves, but socially and more open. Now, I think when we first observe this, we see that one is attempting to not feel ashamed anymore about their nakedness and their vulnerabilities. But what's interesting in this response and the series of posts that people do to embrace their bodies and to show themselves more naked and more vulnerable, that on a very hidden surface, it is great shame that they hide under, or great shame that they are trying in an attempt to compensate and overcome. And I've seen this. I've watched how these people attempt with great effort to be these images and icons of people that have overcome shame. And yet, I've also seen them have what they would call, they're having a hard day, and the shame comes back and haunts them again. Where they no longer feel love for their bodies and they feel ashamed. They feel ashamed of their vulnerabilities and they feel shamed by their acts. One comment from the section can trigger shame again. The exact shame that they are attempting to overcome with their Instagram profiles and all the positivity that they're trying to shed through and enlighten other people. And this is what's really interesting about society now, is that there is this overwhelming positivity, right? Toxic is a word. Toxic should be shamed. We should shame people that are toxic. And yet it seems that in this overwhelming compensation for positivity that we are toxic to ourselves. And that in disguise, in trying to overcome shame, we still shame ourselves in the process. That there is a refusal to acknowledge shame. But we want to paint the picture that we don't feel ashamed. And that's what's really interesting to me. Because I find that ultimately a very painful process for someone. And that's very painful to, in some sense, they're not quite acknowledging their shame. It's a very strange thing, where one feels that they're attempting to overcome their shame. But the moment one gets any response that is not positive to the message that they are trying to portray, they become the shamers and also the shamed. For deep inside, in their response to shaming the other that doesn't quite maybe agree with their point of view or their actions, on a very deep, unconscious level, their anger, their frustration, they feel a great amount of shame. And they're trying to compensate that by being the shamer, being the one that refuses to acknowledge that they actually feel ashamed. And it's not that they should feel ashamed, but it's that they should acknowledge that they do feel ashamed. And how does one have a relationship with it? Is it to simply ignore it? What is our best selves? Is our best selves? Should we just not have a relationship with it? Should we avoid it? Should we say to ourselves, this is just a social construction and that I shouldn't feel ashamed? And perhaps that is true, and that it might be a social construction, but the thing is, you still feel ashamed. So how do you deal with it? Are we ever dealing with it? Or are we succumbing to it in disguise? And I thought that these are good topics to really discuss, because it is also deeply connected to morality. But we assume that it is. And I think that's a very powerful link to separate, actually. To have a discussion about shame. And how this emerges. And how this originates in our childhood. When one does something for the first time, and suddenly we're shamed. We see the disappointment because we want love. We want the care and nourishment. And so in exchange, we shame ourselves to leave that opening so that we can return back to love. We want to return back to that comfort, our childlike comfort again. But see, the problem is that's the only relationship we've ever had to shame. How do we redescribe, how do we rewrite this relationship to shame? To have a proper development in ourselves. And what really struck me is that I read recently from Adam Phillips again, where we are simply children, where he says that we are simply children in adult bodies with the conception of, with childlike ideas of what it means to be an adult. Being adult seems more of an enigma now than anything before. We are still children in adult bodies, but we've stopped pretending. And we take what's real. What we used to take as pretend now is real. Anyways, I hope that is enough to have a conversation, have a discussion, and for those of you that are interested, I would really like to get a group together to have this discussion, because there is so much there to talk about, really. But I'm very interested to hear people's experiences and reflections on this. But anyways, I hope you guys take care. Bye.